In the quiet of the late afternoon, the park was wrapped in the soft glow of the setting sun. The trees stood tall and calm, their branches swaying gently in the cool breeze, and a gentle rustling of leaves whispered across the grass. Sitting alone on a worn wooden bench was an older man, his figure leaning forward slightly as if weighed down by memories. Nathaniel, Nate Adams, cradled an old guitar in his lap, its body scuffed and scratched from years of playing. Nate was tall, though age had slightly curved his shoulders. His hair, fully white, framed a face etched with deep lines of time, especially around his eyes and mouth, signs of both smiles and sorrows he'd carried through life. His dark brown eyes, once bright and lively, now held a certain quietness, a distant look that seemed focused on another time, another place. Nate took a deep breath, his gaze falling on the guitar. He brushed his fingers over its strings, a tender motion, almost as if he were holding hands with an old friend. The silence was broken as he began to strum softly, each note falling into the cool air like a leaf drifting from a tree. The song was an old tune, one he had played countless times before, a melody filled with warmth and longing, a piece he used to play for his wife. She had loved this song, and each note seemed to hold a fragment of the memories they'd shared. His voice, low and worn, joined the gentle strumming. He sang with a kind of tenderness that came from the depths of a quiet heart. This wasn't a performance. It was a tribute, a quiet conversation with someone who was no longer there. Each verse seemed to pull him further into the past, to days spent laughing, holding hands, and living a life that now felt so far away. Across the pathway, a woman sat listening, though Nate hadn't noticed her there. Her name was Grace Thompson, a woman of about 55s with a kind face and light blue eyes that hinted at years of warmth and compassion. Her hair, a mix of silver and chestnut, was neatly pulled back, with a few loose strands framing her face. Grace watched Nate from a distance, drawn to the quiet, unguarded beauty of his song. She hadn't planned on stopping here, but something in the music had caught her attention, pulled her in. The notes stirred something in her, an ache she hadn't felt in years, a reminder of dreams she'd once held close, dreams she had tucked away as life led her down a different path. She didn't know this man, but in his music, she felt a kinship, a shared understanding of lives that hadn't turned out quite as they'd imagined. For a moment, they were two strangers sitting apart, bound by a song filled with memories, losses, and hopes quietly held onto. The next day, as the sun once again began its slow descent, Nate returned to his familiar spot in the park. He settled onto the same old bench, the guitar resting across his lap. This place had become a kind of sanctuary, a space where he could feel closer to her, to their shared memories. As he started to play, the familiar chords filled the air, his fingers moving naturally across the strings. Not far away, Grace had found her way back to the park as well. She sat quietly on a bench a short distance away, her eyes following the gentle sway of Nate's fingers on the guitar. She listened as he sang, his voice carrying a subtle, weathered warmth, almost as if each note was wrapped in the memories of a life deeply lived. Today, however, she couldn't just listen from afar. Gathering her courage, Grace rose and walked over, stopping a few steps from where he sat. When the last chord faded into the evening air, she softly cleared her throat, offering a gentle, tentative smile. Nate looked up, a bit startled, but returned her smile with a warmth that reached his eyes. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, sharing a silent understanding. "I couldn't help but listen," Grace began, her voice gentle, a bit uncertain. "The way you play, it feels like there's a story behind each note." Nate nodded slowly, his gaze dropping briefly to the guitar before meeting her eyes again. "There is?" he said, his voice low but steady. "I play for my wife. She passed away a few years ago." He paused, the weight of his words settling between them. This was her favorite song. Playing it, it helps keep her close. Grace's expression softened, her eyes holding a touch of sadness and understanding. She hesitated, then spoke, her words carrying a note of her own regrets. "I understand. I used to have dreams of my own, dreams of becoming a musician, but life had other plans, and eventually, I let those dreams go." They fell silent for a moment, both lost in their thoughts. Though they were strangers, there was something binding them in this moment, a shared recognition of love, loss, and the quiet ache of dreams set aside. The following afternoon, Nate found himself looking forward to his time in the park, hoping he might see Grace again. He didn't have to wait long. As he settled onto his usual bench and began strumming his guitar, he caught sight of her walking along the path. She approached with a warm smile, and this time, she took a seat beside him without hesitation. For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the soft notes of Nate's guitar filling the air. Eventually, Grace turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began softly, "when I was younger, I used to dream about playing on stage. I wanted to be a musician, to share my own songs with the world." She paused, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. "But life, well, sometimes life takes us in different directions. I got married, had a family, and before I knew it, those dreams were just memories." Nate listened, nodding slowly, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "I get that," he replied. "Life has a way of pulling us along, doesn't it? I was lucky enough to make music with my wife. She was the one who kept me going, kept the music alive in me." He looked down at his guitar, his fingers resting gently on the strings. After she passed, it felt like the music went with her. But somehow, playing here, it brings her back to me, even if just for a little while. Grace placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, offering a comfort that went beyond words. "Maybe," she said quietly, "playing here is your way of keeping that part of her alive, of holding on to what you both shared." They fell silent again, the weight of their shared losses and dreams left unsaid but deeply felt. After a while, Grace spoke up, her voice carrying a note of hesitancy. "Do you think," she began, glancing down as if unsure, "do you think it's too late to pick up those dreams again? I mean, for someone like me?" Nate's gaze softened, a gentle smile appearing on his face. "It's never too late," he replied, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Music doesn't care about age or time or what might have happened along the way. If it's something you still feel in here," he placed a hand over his heart, "then it's worth holding on to." Grace looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and vulnerability. In that moment, she felt a spark she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of a dream she thought she'd left behind. As the days passed, Nate and Grace found themselves meeting regularly in the park, each afternoon a quiet ritual of music and conversation. They shared stories of their lives, their families, and the choices they'd made along the way. The more they spoke, the more they found a deep resonance in each other's words, a common thread of love, sacrifice, and unfulfilled dreams. One afternoon, after a gentle melody had drifted into the crisp autumn air, Grace sat quietly beside Nate, her gaze distant. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on her notebook. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting Nate's with a touch of vulnerability. "You know, Nate," she began slowly, "I didn't realize how much I missed this. Just being around music. For so long, I pushed that part of myself aside. I told myself that it wasn't practical, that my family needed me more than my dreams did." She paused, a faint sadness coloring her voice. "But listening to you play, it brings everything back. It makes me wonder, what if I'd chosen differently?" Nate listened, his expression thoughtful and kind. "We all make choices, Grace," he said gently, "and sometimes those choices are necessary. But that doesn't mean we have to let go of who we are. Sometimes the things we leave behind are still waiting for us, just like an old song we can play again." Grace smiled softly, a hint of hope stirring within her. She looked down, almost shyly, as she spoke again. Would you ever consider playing somewhere else? Somewhere other than the park?" Nate tilted his head, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "What do you mean?" Grace took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we could play together. I don't know where or when, but just something. It's silly, I know. I haven't picked up an instrument in years, and I probably wouldn't even remember how, but there's a part of me that wants to try, to see if I can find that part of myself again." Nate's eyes softened, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "Grace," he said warmly, "it's not silly at all. Music doesn't forget, and if you're willing, I'd be honored to play alongside you, wherever and whenever that might be." In that moment, Grace felt a wave of gratitude and courage she hadn't felt in a long time. She reached out, giving Nate's hand a gentle squeeze, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to reclaim the dream she'd left behind. A few days later, as they sat in their usual spot in the park, Nate turned to Grace with a thoughtful look in his eyes. He seemed to have something on his mind, a glimmer of excitement mixed with uncertainty. "Grace," he began, pausing to gather his words. "Thanksgiving is coming up soon, and I've heard they're holding a small event at the community center. It's nothing fancy, just a gathering of folks from around town. They've asked me a few times over the years if I'd be willing to play, but, well, I never had the heart to do it alone." He looked at her, his gaze earnest and inviting. "But maybe if you're willing, maybe we could play together." Grace's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and apprehension crossing her face. "Oh, Nate, I haven't performed in front of anyone in decades. I'm not sure I even remember how." Nate placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice soft and steady. "You don't have to be perfect, Grace. Music isn't about perfection, it's about feeling. And you've got that in spades. You just have to let yourself share it." She looked down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Part of her wanted to say yes, to dive into this chance she'd never thought she'd have again. But fear crept in, the fear of being vulnerable, of putting herself out there after all these years. "But what if I can't do it?" she whispered, barely looking up. Nate's voice was gentle but firm. "Grace, music has been waiting for you. And if you take this chance, I'll be right there beside you. We'll take it one step at a time. Just think of it as sharing something we both love with people who'll understand." Grace let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of her insecurities lighten, just a bit. She looked up, meeting his steady gaze, and saw the quiet encouragement in his eyes. In that moment, something shifted. She didn't have to do it alone, and that simple truth gave her the strength to nod. "All right, Nate," she said, a small, hopeful smile forming on her lips. "Let's do it. Let's play together for Thanksgiving." In the days that followed, Nate and Grace began meeting regularly, not just in the park, but at the community center where they would soon perform. The quiet, empty hall felt almost sacred as they prepared, its walls holding the promise of the music they were about to share with the community. Their first practice was a little shaky. Grace's fingers felt stiff and unpracticed as she attempted to play simple chords on a borrowed keyboard, and Nate's guitar strums were slower than usual, as if he were easing into a forgotten rhythm. There were moments of hesitation, quick glances exchanged, and even a few chuckles as they fumbled through their song selections. But amid the stumbles, there was also laughter and gentle encouragement. At one point, Grace paused, her hands hovering over the keys. She looked up at Nate, a mix of nerves and hope in her expression. "It's harder than I remembered," she admitted, her voice soft. Nate smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. "That's all right, Grace. We're not here to impress anyone. We're here to share a part of ourselves. Just let the music come to you." As the days passed, they grew more comfortable, their notes blending and harmonizing in ways that felt natural and right. With each practice, Grace felt her old self slowly resurfacing. The young woman who had once dreamed of performing, the girl who had loved the feeling of music flowing through her fingers. One evening, as they were packing up, Grace turned to Nate, her voice thoughtful. "I didn't realize how much I missed this," she said quietly. "It's like a part of me that I thought I'd lost is coming back." Nate placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression soft. "I think we both needed this. Music has a way of reminding us who we are, even when we've forgotten." There were still moments of doubt, of course. On days when Grace struggled with a particular piece, or when her hands shook slightly, she would look to Nate, her eyes filled with unspoken fears. And each time, Nate would smile, offer a nod of reassurance, or simply play a quiet melody that brought her back to the moment. As Thanksgiving approached, their practice sessions took on a quieter, more reverent tone. They were no longer just two people rehearsing. They were two friends, sharing a journey of rediscovery and healing. Together, they were bringing their dreams back to life, one note at a time. As the final days before Thanksgiving arrived, the weight of the upcoming performance began to settle heavily on Grace's shoulders. Each night, as she practiced alone, doubts crept in, whispering to her that she might not be ready, that she'd waited too long to return to the music she had once loved. One evening, after a particularly frustrating practice, she let her hands fall from the keyboard, her shoulders slumping. The familiar notes felt clumsy, her fingers tense and unsteady. Her heart pounded with anxiety, and she felt an overwhelming urge to give up. The next day, as she and Nate sat down for their last rehearsal, Grace's hesitancy was clear. She barely touched the keys, her gaze lowered, avoiding his eyes. Nate noticed her silence and gently placed his guitar aside, leaning forward to catch her attention. "Grace," he said softly, "is everything all right?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nate, I don't think I can do this. It feels too big, too much. I'm afraid I'll let you down and I'll look foolish." Nate listened patiently, his gaze steady and kind. He took a deep breath and reached out, covering her hands with his. "Grace, remember why we're doing this," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "We're not here to be perfect. We're here to share something real, something we love. It doesn't matter if there are mistakes. What matters is that we're showing up and giving a part of ourselves." She looked up, meeting his eyes, and in them she saw a reflection of her own fears, softened by his unwavering belief in her. "But what if I freeze up?" she whispered. "Then we'll keep going," Nate replied with a gentle smile. "And I'll be right beside you, every step of the way. We're in this together." Grace felt a small, steadying comfort from his words. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly less. "Thank you, Nate," she murmured. I needed to hear that." As they resumed their practice, Grace found a new strength in the music, a quiet assurance that hadn't been there before. She wasn't alone, and as she played, she let go of her fears, note by note, trusting that the person beside her would be there, ready to catch her if she stumbled. By the end of the evening, the doubts had faded into the background. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for the music, for the second chance, and for the friendship that had given her the courage to step back into a dream she thought she'd left behind. The day of Thanksgiving arrived, and the community center buzzed with warmth and excitement. Families gathered in clusters, friends exchanged smiles and hugs, and the aroma of holiday dishes filled the air. The room was decorated with simple touches: autumn leaves, flickering candles, and garlands of orange and gold that gave the space a cozy, welcoming glow. In a small room off to the side, Nate and Grace prepared themselves. Nate adjusted the strap of his guitar, glancing over at Grace, who was taking a few deep breaths, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the keyboard in front of her. Despite the weeks of practice, a flutter of nervousness still danced in her chest. She looked up at Nate, her expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. "This is really happening, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of conversation from the main hall. Nate nodded, a gentle smile on his face. "It is, and we're ready, Grace. Remember, we're not here to be perfect. We're here to share something meaningful." Grace nodded, trying to let his words sink in. But as the minutes ticked by, her heart pounded, and the familiar fears began creeping in again. What if she stumbled? What if her fingers froze up and the notes didn't come? Sensing her tension, Nate reached out and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We're in this together," he reminded her, his voice steady and calming. "Just like we practiced. And if you need me, just look my way. I'll be right there with you." Grace took a deep breath, feeling a small wave of calm wash over her. She squeezed his hand in return, offering a shaky smile. "Thank you, Nate. I don't think I could have done this without you." The call came, and they both walked out onto the small stage, greeted by warm smiles and encouraging applause from the gathered community. The lights were soft, the faces friendly, and as Grace looked out over the crowd, a sense of belonging settled over her. Nate began to play the opening chords, his fingers moving smoothly over the strings. Grace joined in, her fingers finding the keys, and together their music filled the room, blending together like old friends finally meeting again. At first, Grace's hands shook, but as she continued, she felt Nate's presence beside her, steady and unwavering. The melody flowed, gentle and warm, and her nerves slowly faded, replaced by a quiet joy. She glanced at Nate, and he gave her an encouraging nod, his own eyes filled with pride and reassurance. As they reached the final notes, the room fell into a hushed silence, followed by a wave of applause and a few tearful smiles in the crowd. Grace felt a swell of gratitude, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She looked at Nate, and in that moment she knew. This was more than a performance. It was a reclaiming of something precious, something she had thought was lost forever. They both took a bow, hands clasped, sharing a quiet smile that spoke of courage, friendship, and dreams brought back to life. As the final notes of their performance lingered in the air, Nate and Grace stood together, hand in hand, overwhelmed by the warmth of the applause that echoed through the room. The audience rose to their feet, clapping and smiling, some with tears glistening in their eyes. The response was more than either of them had expected, filling the space with a sense of community and shared emotion that went beyond words. Grace felt a swell of emotion, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and disbelief. She looked over at Nate, her eyes brimming with gratitude. For so long, she'd carried the weight of her forgotten dreams, believing they were too far gone to reach for again. Yet here she was, on this stage, not only playing music but feeling alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The applause began to fade, but a few people lingered close, waiting to speak with them. An elderly couple approached, the woman reaching out to clasp Grace's hand with both of hers. "That was beautiful," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "You brought back memories of when we were young, when my husband used to sing to me. Thank you for sharing this with us." Grace squeezed the woman's hand, her own eyes misty. "Thank you for listening," she replied softly. "It means so much to be here." Nate, meanwhile, was approached by a few friends from the community center, people he hadn't seen in years. They patted his back, congratulated him, and thanked him for bringing music into their lives again. For the first time in a long time, Nate felt more than just a performer. He felt a sense of purpose, of connection to the people around him. As they continued to receive thanks and kind words, Nate leaned over to Grace, his voice quiet but filled with awe. "We did it, Grace. We really did it." She nodded, her smile radiant. "I didn't realize how much I needed this, to feel part of something again." As the crowd gradually dispersed, leaving only a handful of lingering guests, Grace and Nate stood together, taking in the quiet that had settled after the applause. They looked at each other, sharing a moment of deep understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken to reach this place. It was more than a performance. It was a gift to each other, to themselves, and to the people who had gathered to listen. And as they walked off the stage together, they both knew that this was only the beginning. In the days following the Thanksgiving performance, the community center was abuzz with talk of Nate and Grace's heartfelt music. People stopped them on the street, in grocery stores, and even at the park to offer their thanks and share how much the performance had meant to them. The gratitude was overwhelming, filling their hearts with a sense of belonging they hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, as Nate and Grace sat on their familiar bench in the park, a small group of people from the community center approached them, each one eager to express their appreciation. "You know," began one woman, a gentle smile lighting up her face, "my mother hasn't stopped talking about your performance. She's been humming those songs every day since. It's like it's given her something to look forward to." A man nodded in agreement, his eyes warm. "You two brought back something special that night. We felt every note, every word. It was a reminder of the things that matter most." Grace felt her cheeks flush, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she replied softly. "I never thought that playing music again could mean so much to so many people." Nate smiled, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We did it for ourselves, but it turns out it was for everyone," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "Maybe that's the real gift of music." The group lingered for a few more moments, sharing stories and laughter, reliving the joy of the performance. As they finally began to disperse, one of the women turned back to them, a hopeful expression on her face. "Would you consider doing it again?" she asked. "There are so many people who missed it and would love to hear you both play. Maybe it could be something you do for the community?" Nate and Grace exchanged a look, both of them feeling a gentle spark of excitement. They hadn't thought about performing again, but the idea felt right, like a natural extension of what they had already begun. Grace nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "I think we'd love that," she said, looking to Nate, who gave an encouraging nod in return. "Yes," he agreed. "We'd love nothing more than to keep sharing the music with all of you." As they watched the group walk away, Nate and Grace sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the impact of what they had created together. They had taken a chance, faced their fears, and in doing so, they had found not only a renewed love for music, but also a place within a community that cherished their presence. In that quiet moment, they knew that the music would continue, not just as a tribute to the past, but as a way to bring joy to the lives of those around them. As winter settled in and the holidays approached, Nate and Grace found themselves preparing for another performance at the community center. Word had spread about their Thanksgiving debut, and many in the community eagerly awaited another evening of music and connection. The anticipation was a new kind of joy for both of them, a feeling of purpose that they hadn't known in years. They met at the community center every week, working together on new songs and refining the ones they had already performed. Their routines felt natural now, the nervousness replaced by a quiet confidence. With each practice, they found themselves more attuned to one another's rhythm, their music flowing easily, like a conversation between two old friends. One snowy afternoon, as they packed up after a practice session, Grace paused, looking at Nate with a thoughtful smile. "You know, Nate," she began, "I never thought I'd be doing this again. Sharing music, feeling connected. I thought those parts of my life were gone. But here we are and it feels right." Nate nodded, his own smile warm and understanding. "I feel the same. I thought music had left me when my wife passed, but now, it's like it's come back, even stronger." He paused, his eyes thoughtful. "And it's not just for us, is it? It's for them too, for the people who come to listen, who find something they need in our music." Grace nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "It's like we've been given a second chance, not just to play, but to bring something meaningful to the people around us." The evening of their next performance arrived, and as they stepped onto the stage, the room felt even fuller than it had at Thanksgiving. Familiar faces beamed up at them, joined by new ones, all eager to experience the warmth of their music. Nate began to strum the first song, a gentle melody that flowed into the room, wrapping around the audience like a warm embrace. Grace joined in, her fingers moving over the keys with a confidence she hadn't known before. The music felt effortless, each note resonating with the love and gratitude that had grown between them. When the performance ended, the applause was thunderous, filled with the appreciation of friends, neighbors, and strangers who had come together to share in the joy that Nate and Grace had rekindled. It was a moment that transcended words, a quiet testament to the healing power of music and connection. As they stepped off the stage, Grace turned to Nate, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you, Nate, for everything." He gave her a gentle smile, his own eyes misty. "No, Grace, thank you. You brought the music back to life for both of us." And with that, they knew they would continue this journey together, not just for themselves, but for the community that had welcomed them so wholeheartedly. Together, they had created something far greater than they had ever imagined, a place where they belonged, and where they could bring light and warmth to those around them, one song at a time. In the months that followed, Nate and Grace became familiar faces at the community center. Each performance was a gift, not just to the audience, but to themselves. They played for holiday gatherings, small events, and impromptu gatherings, each song another step in reclaiming the dreams they had left behind. One sunny spring afternoon, they found themselves on an outdoor stage, surrounded by familiar faces and new ones alike. Children laughed and ran through the grass, elders sat in comfortable chairs, and couples held hands, all gathered to share in the music that had become a beloved part of their lives. As Nate strummed the opening chords of a familiar tune, Grace joined in, her voice soft but full of life. Together, their music filled the air, floating on the breeze, touching each person who listened. For Nate and Grace, this was more than just a performance. It was a celebration of everything they had found in each other: friendship, courage, and a renewed sense of purpose. Grace looked out at the crowd, her heart swelling with gratitude. She could see the smiles, the way people leaned in to listen, and she felt a deep joy she hadn't known was possible. She turned to Nate, who met her gaze with a warm, knowing smile. They didn't need words to understand what this moment meant. As they reached the final notes, they let the music linger, letting it settle into the hearts of those around them. When the last chord faded, the audience rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, and some even wiping away tears. It was a moment of pure connection, a reminder that no matter the obstacles life had placed in their paths, they had found a way to bring light and love to others. As they took their final bow, hand in hand, Grace leaned toward Nate, her voice filled with emotion. "We did it, Nate. We really did it." Nate nodded, his own eyes misty with gratitude. "And it's only the beginning, Grace. We've got so much more to share." With smiles and waves, they left the stage, their hearts full, knowing that they had created something beautiful together. And as they walked away, they carried with them the music, the memories, and the knowledge that they had, in each other, found a place to belong, a dream to cherish, and a purpose that would continue to bring joy to everyone they touched. In that quiet moment, Nate and Grace knew that their journey was far from over. The music would go on, carrying with it the spirit of two hearts that had come together to reclaim the dreams of a lifetime. As the sun began to set on their final performance of the season, Nate and Grace found themselves once again seated together, watching the crowd slowly disperse, their hearts full of the warmth that only music and friendship could bring. The gentle hum of conversations faded, leaving a peaceful stillness in the air. For a moment, they sat in silence, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Grace turned to Nate, her voice soft but filled with a sense of wonder. "You know, Nate, I used to think that dreams had an expiration date, that they were only for the young, for people with all the time in the world." She paused, glancing down, her fingers brushing against the keys of the silent keyboard. "But this has shown me that they're always there, waiting for us." Nate nodded thoughtfully, his eyes focused on the horizon. "Life has a way of steering us, doesn't it? Sometimes away from the things we love. But if we're lucky, those things find a way back to us, even if it's years later." He looked at her, a small smile forming. "And sometimes we find someone to share it with." They sat quietly, letting the weight of his words sink in. Their story wasn't just about reclaiming a dream. It was about discovering that friendship, no matter how unexpected, could bring new meaning to old passions. They had learned that no matter where life had taken them, there was always room for second chances. The community, too, had played its part. Each performance had reminded Nate and Grace that the gifts we carry aren't just for ourselves, but are meant to be shared, creating ripples of joy, connection, and gratitude. Their journey had become a testament to the power of companionship, to finding courage in vulnerability, and to embracing the beauty of each day, no matter how late it arrived. As they rose from the bench, Nate offered Grace his arm. They walked away together, their steps light and easy, knowing they would carry this experience with them always. In the quiet of the evening, it was clear. It's never too late to follow a dream, to find a friend, and to bring light to the world in ways that truly matter.